In the previous video segment, we defined learning theory, reviewed learning theory's purpose and instruction, and examined learning theory's relation to instructional system development. In this video segment, we examine the behaviorism theory and its application to the instructional system.
You may be asking, what is behaviorism theory? And what does it have to do with learning? Behaviorism theory arose in an attempt to make psychology more objective and is also referred to as traditional learning theory. The focus of behaviorism theory is on changes in observable behavior. Specifically, behavior is objective and observable, as behavior is the response of an organism to stimuli. Early research studies started with animals and transferred to humans.
Considering that the focus of the behaviorism theory is on changes in observable behavior, one might ask, is there more than one type of behavior? And the answer is yes. First, there is involuntary behavior, which involves associating an involuntary response and a stimulus. This is known as classical conditioning, which explains some learning of involuntary, emotional, and physical response to a stimulus. Conversely, there is voluntary behavior, which involves associating a voluntary behavior and a consequence. This is known as operant conditioning, where there is reinforcement of the behavior by a reward or a punishment. Let's first examine classical conditioning.
The concept of classical conditioning was developed by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Remember Pavlov's famous experiments with dogs commonly known today as Pavlov's dogs? Pavlov's was initially studying the role of salivation in digestion, more specifically how much saliva dogs produce when given meat. However, after several days, Pavlov noticed the dogs began salivating when the researcher opened the lab door to feed them.
So, out of curiosity, Pavlov began conducting experiments studying the association between stimulus and response. Pavlov discovered that after several times of sounding a bell just before presenting the food, the dog began salivating at the sound of a bell ringing, thus forming a conditioned stimulus-response association. Pavlov's research demonstrated that stimuli could be associated with one another and thus produce similar responses. As in the case of the dogs had learned to associate the bell with food. The results of Pavlov's research were published in 1897.
Influenced by Pavlov's work, John V. Watson conducted studies that included Pavlov's classical conditioning principles. Watson, considered to be the father of behaviorism, published an article entitled "Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It." He argues that psychology should be the science of behavior rather than the mind. Based on Pavlov's work on conditioned stimulus, Watson demonstrated the same effect with children in his Little Albert study. Watson conditioned baby Albert to fear furry objects that had been presented at the same time a loud, scary noise occurred. In a following study, Watson found that the fear behavior could be unlearned by making new associations with stimuli.
As reflected in the quote shown, Watson firmly believed that babies are a blank slate and, as such, he could use the principles of behaviorism to train the child to be any type of professional specialist. Now let's examine operant conditioning.
The first theory of learning that explained a wide variety of outcomes was instrumental conditioning, also known as operant conditioning, developed by Edward Thorndike. His work was among the initial attempts to examine and explain memory and learning. Operant conditioning involves conditioning voluntary, controllable behaviors, not the automatic physiological responses in classical conditioning. With operant conditioning, the response comes before the stimulus, the opposite of classical conditioning. Thorndike tested his theories by studying response times of cats trying to get out of a puzzle box. He theorized that learning involves trial and error behavior, with practice facilitating the learning of responses. As depicted in the graphic, the cat was placed in a box which had a lever the cat could push to escape. A piece of fish was placed outside the box as encouragement for the cat to escape the box. The cat would try different ways to escape the box until it pressed a lever which opened the box. Once out, Thorndike would place the cat back into the box to repeat the experiment, documenting how long it took the cat to escape. The graphic shown demonstrates the general decreasing trend of the cat's response times with each successive trial. The cat learned that pressing the lever would result in getting to the piece of fish, a favorable consequence, thus modifying its behavior in order to escape the box faster. His experiments advanced Watson's theories on the impact of positive and negative consequences on behavior, thus concluding that repetition and reward were critical factors in learning. Thorndike's findings led to the law of effect, which claims that the consequences of a behavior determine whether it is likely to be repeated. Now let's examine B.F. Skinner's contribution to behaviorism theory.
B.F. Skinner's principles of operant conditioning extends the ideas of Thorndike. Skinner was interested in education and believed that behavior is sustained by reinforcements or reward, not by free will. His basic premise is that behavior can be controlled by consequences, meaning the type of reinforcement the individual receives following the behavior. He conducted response studies with rats and pigeons and observed that responses are strengthened by reinforcers or consequences that increase the frequency of a behavior. As in the case of the study with rats, Skinner created the Skinner box, which is shown in the graphic, and studied the association between the rat pressing the metal bar, which are responses, and the rat getting the food when pressing the bar, reinforcers. Skinner applied what he learned with these animals to human learning. Skinner described operant behaviors as actions individuals take to meet the demands of their environments, and identified 3 types of responses, or operant, that can follow behavior. 1. Neutral operants, which are responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. 2. Reinforcers, which are responses from the environment that increase the probability of a behavior being repeated. Reinforcers can be either positive or negative. And 3. Punishers, which are responses from the environment that decrease the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. Punishment weakens behavior. Skinner's concept of reinforcement is fundamental, as it is an event that increases the probability of behavior reoccurring. Now let's examine the influence of behaviorism theory on curriculum development and instruction.
Behaviorism equates learning with behaviors that can be observed and measured. Therefore, behaviorism learning theory is applicable to technical training curriculum development and instruction. The curriculum for behaviorists should be organized around straightforward learning objectives and clearly stated learning outcomes. Behaviorists argue that anything that cannot be measured does not exist or cannot be important or trustworthy enough to play a role in the curriculum. Behaviorist curriculum reinforces the structured learning that has predetermined objectives for what is to be learned, as well as predetermined reinforcers when objectives are met. In this type of learning, the end goal is defined up front, and each step necessary to achieve the goal is given to the learner. In addition, step-by-step conditioning programs known as classical and operant conditioning are used to achieve the desired behavior, and rewards are used to motivate the learner.
Reinforcement is key to successful transfer through behavioristic learning. There is a strong emphasis on the stimulus, the response, and the relationship between them. For example, within the instructional system, applying classical conditioning by redesigning the classroom environment, such as a scale-up design, can help reduce student anxiety, as the design facilitates interactions between teams of students working collaboratively on assigned activities, thus helping reduce student anxiety. So instead of being fearful of not doing well in class, Students in a scale-up environment that are working in teams stay relaxed and will effectively contribute to the learning experience within the group to pass the course.
In viewing the graphic, behavior is preceded by an antecedent, which is a cue in the environment that requires a response by the learner. The initial response to the antecedent is known as the operand. The stimulus that follows the response is the consequence. Remember, reinforcement is a consequence that increases the probability that a behavior will occur, whereas punishment is a consequence that decreases the probability a behavior will occur. Stated in a different way, reinforcement strengthens the behavior, while punishment weakens the behavior. When considering instructional system development, reinforcers are more effective when they are given as soon as possible after the student performs the target behavior. Several strategies can be incorporated to facilitate operant conditioning. For example, chunking lessons provides consistent opportunities for operant conditioning, as feedback is the key to achieving the target behavior. Additionally, developing a schedule of reinforcement can facilitate continuous reinforcement. Ways to incorporate scheduled reinforcement into curriculum development is through scheduled quizzes, pop quizzes, and reinforcement for achieving target behavior. For instance, when facilitating a lecture, the instructor praises a student for asking a question. In receiving positive reinforcement from the instructor, the student receives something pleasant, which will increase the student's behavior for asking questions. Conversely, negative reinforcement is the removing of something unpleasant, which subsequently increases behavior occurrence. For example, an airman who is tired of being counseled on not completing pre-work for the course by his supervisor will complete his pre-work. The airman is achieving the target behavior to remove the counseling. When it comes to punishment as operant conditioning, it can be difficult to distinguish from negative reinforcement. Remember that punishment is designed to weaken or eliminate a response rather than increase it. For instance, in the basic instructor course, instructors apply specific punishment techniques to reduce distracting speech habits students exhibit when performing public speaking activities. The approach directly applies an unpleasant stimulus like a shock after a response, in this case an unwanted speech habit, to weaken or eliminate the response. In short, reinforcement tells you what to do, punishment only tells you what not to do. As such, integrating operant conditioning strategies into instructional systems in order to change environmental events that are related to a person's behavior is key to class and student management. Operant conditioning is relevant to shaping skill performance.
In conclusion, the main points of behaviorism are: 1. Behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behavior as opposed to internal events like thinking and emotion. 2. The major influence on human behavior is learning from our environment. 3. Individuals are constantly learning new behaviors and modifying existing behavior via classical or operant conditioning. And finally, behaviorism focuses on how this learning takes place. In the next video segment, we examine cognitive theory.